I didn't notice the static until I unplugged everything. And I don't mean the kind of hiss you get when a station slips out of range and the needle hunts for it. I mean a sound with a spine, a low tide exhale that flattened itself along the baseboards and kept its shape when I stepped through it, patient as fog, busy as breath. It was late, a Wednesday, the sort of hour when windows become mirrors and you stop checking your phone because the light hurts, and I was sitting on the living room floor with my back against the couch and the radio in my lap, the cord scissored clean with a pair of kitchen shears I didn't remember fetching, the plug limp in my palm like a dead worm. The hiss kept going. It didn't even shudder. I cupped my ear to the unplugged speaker, feeling ridiculous, and felt the faintest vibration tick through the paper cone, not like sound exactly, but like a thought tapping its fingernail. Me, it said, or I decided it said. The way your brain ties a rope between noises because it can't stand a gap. I said hello. The building answered with a fork. 1 tap, 2. A tiny, clear syllable of metal on porcelain from the sink that made me feel suddenly watched in the way you feel watched in a museum full of portraits that have lost the names under their frames. The static shifted, rasping more than hissing now, and I knew something about it then that I didn't want to know yet. I wasn't listening to a radio. I was listening to the room. I had moved into 4B because it was cheap, because it had a window onto a slice of water and a real bathtub with feet, because the landlord handed me the keys with the fast shrug of a man relieved to be rid of a conversation, because the elevator worked 3 out of 5 times and I liked my odds, because when the agent opened the door the first time, cool air rushed past us like someone late for the train. I told myself it was a draft and sighed. The first week, the usual city chaos wrapped itself around me like a blanket woven by a forgetful aunt. Sirens in the middle distance, laughter that sounded like arguments through the wall, the trash truck at 5:30 pounding the morning flat. The only wrong note was the radio, which began to pick up a low seethe even when tuned dead middle between stations, even when I turned the volume to 0, even when I tucked it into the closet and shut the door as if scolding a dog. The second week, words began to form in the fuzz, not words you could write down, not even words my mouth knew how to make, but shapes that pressed against the inside of the sound like hands at frosted glass. When I whispered a test, water, the bathroom faucet coughed and bled a thin stream and then died as if embarrassed. When I said keys, the bowl by the door rang like a small bell and my keyring lifted and settled again with a single decisive clink, the way a judge lifts a mallet more for ritual than for force. I slept on the couch after that, my feet tucked toward the door like a sprinter already leaning toward the gun. I told no one. I pretended to myself that I was listening to the radiator learn a new language, to building bones, practicing consonants, to the way electricity talks to itself when the lights are off. On Sunday, my upstairs neighbor in the $1,000 heels knocked and asked if I was running a fan all night, or if I had an old TV with a dying tube. It's coming through my floor, she said, like ocean. Her lipstick had bled into the cracks at the corner of her mouth. I shook my head and said I didn't own a TV. Liar, the speaker croaked after I shut the door. The sound so clear and wrong coming from a thing without a throat that I almost laughed because fear and humor share a border. I started recording. I pointed my phone at the speaker, at the air, at the hallway, at nothing. And in the morning I played it back and heard only room tone. some low rumble I could tell myself was trucks shifting gears across the river. But when I put the headphones on and turned the volume up until the waveform was a fat snake on the screen, I could hear, behind the sound, thinner sound, like a whisper dragged across teeth. Don't what? Don't go. Don't listen. Don't say your name out loud in an empty room. I didn't ask. The building answered anyway, the way buildings do, because buildings know you as intimately and indifferently as showers know your shoulders and stairs know your calves. The elevator doors began opening before I pressed the button, awkwardly eager, like a child trying to anticipate where you want to go. The hallway light brightened when I raised an eyebrow at it, and once, when I tested a word in the static, open. The dryer door down in the laundry room popped wide and clanged against the machine's side like it had received orders. I laughed then, sharp and delighted, and the static tried to laugh back and got it wrong, the way someone learning your language gets the vowels right and the music wrong. That night the speaker said a single word with a mouth I could not see. Basement. I carried the radio like a pet with a fever, down the 2 flights that smell like rain whenever anyone comes in wet, into the warm, stale belly of the building where the boiler ticks loud enough to rearrange your heartbeat. The fluorescent tubes hummed in that way that is either comfort or threat depending on your childhood. The metal cabinet with the breakers sat squat and important against the far wall, its painted over handle grimed with every hand that had loved and cursed it. The speaker throbbed in my arms. Me, the hiss said, farther than sound should come, and nearer than is polite. Who? I asked, and a single breaker clicked down, then up, like a shrug or a blink. The washing machine to my right started and sloshed without quarters inside it. Heat gathered behind my knees in a way that made me think of the line cooks I used to work with, who could tell if a grill was ready by holding their hand above it for 1 second, 2, 3. Me, the voice insisted. And then it did something unkind. It borrowed my voice to say my name. The speaker made my mouth, not just the pitch, not the obvious trick, the shape. Aiden, it said in my voice, and I felt my own name like a key turning in the lock behind my ribs. Don't go, it said, and the sound of my fear in my voice made the room meaner. I ran then, because there is a point at which curiosity becomes a dare, and my childhood was full of men who didn't survive dares. On the stairs, 2 bulbs went hard white and blue, and glass dust sifted down like fine weather and stuck to my hair and cheeks, so I glittered in my door peephole like someone else's party. I slammed into my apartment, and my phone lit with a voicemail from an unknown number, and I pressed play, and there I was telling myself basement 10 minutes earlier, and then I wasn't anything, just breath and the grey smear of thinking. The radio remained down there alone with the boiler and the humming tubes and the way metal speaks heat. The hiss had moved into my walls. You can't be me, I said into the empty space, because declaring things feels like action. The stove light came on with a click. You're not me. The hiss arranged itself into a soft keening, and the kitchen drawer opened and shut once, twice. The fork tapped thrice like a polite knock. That night I slept the way you sleep in hospitals, eyes closed, because that's what eyes do when your body is flat, mouth dry, hands making fists when you aren't looking. At 3, the smoke detector's red dot blinked a patient pattern. 2, 1, 2, 1, as if asking me to join, and another unknown number called. and left nothing. In the morning, the sign on the basement door said, "Electrical work today," with tape thick as caution, and the metal knob held heat against my palm, as if the door had been sitting in the sun. I went down anyway, because I have never learned to win an argument with my own bad ideas. The radio lay where I dropped it, face down, dignified about it. The speaker was quiet, the way a mouth is quiet when it knows it will be asked to do work soon. "Aidan," my own voice said from the concrete wall, without benefit of speaker or duct or any honest throat. And that was worse than any other thing that had happened to me recently. Worse than the way the building had brightened for my eyebrows. Worse than the forks. Tiny syllables, because it meant what I had suspected. The building had learned me, or had been me once, and what it wanted was custody. I understood then, in the small way you understand a rule you already obey. The strange kindness of the elevator door, the way the hallway lights waited for my face, the dryer door that obeyed me like a trained mouth. It wasn't mimicry, it was memory. "What happens if I leave?" I asked, and above my head a door banged and the boiler clanged and the building flexed its old muscles the way an animal does before it runs or a father does before. He lifts a sleeping child wrong and hurts his back, but keeps carrying because the child doesn't weigh what he weighs. The child weighs everything he can lose. "Don't," my voice said from the wall. So I stayed. I called in sick and lay on the floor and let the static murmur the weather from 5 days ago and the names of things in my kitchen and the exact inventory of mistakes I had made in this apartment so far. I said window, and the blinds lifted like a polite dress. I said open, and the air moved over my face fresh and wet like someone washing me in a story. At dusk, the storm arrived with that instant bones lightning that outlines buildings like X-rays. In 5C, a radio woke shrieking, and the radio in 2A moaned low like a boat, and my unplugged speaker sparkled around the mouth like a struck match, and the hiss learned teeth, and then my voice said, "Don't go with my younger breath," and with what I realized was my older breath too, a rasp I hadn't earned yet, and the mirror fogged and wrote my name and cleared and fogged and wrote, "You left last time." And when the power died, the sound did not, and that terrified me in a clean way, the way a fresh white bandage terrifies you because it proves there is a wound even if you cannot see it. I moved a week later, because moving is what I do when I don't know what else to do. The apartment across the river had new outlets and a stove that lit without prayer, and a silence that people pay for because it feels like evidence that they are not alone in the worst way. The first night, placing a single fork in a single drawer, my phone buzzed, and an unknown number left a voicemail that was all hiss until my voice, or the idea of my voice, said basement as if the word were a magnet and I were metal. I didn't go back. I woke every day and flipped on the kitchen light and said hello under my breath and waited like a fool for the room to choose me. It didn't. The hiss didn't follow. What followed was the knowing that nobody else would know, that the building that knows you can keep a grip on your name even when you change your address. I kept the radio unplugged and obedient on a closet shelf, and I taught myself to listen to honest noises. The sigh of my coat easing from my shoulders, the bubble of the kettle at the exact second before it boils, the way souls sound different depending on what kind of day they will carry. I lasted 3 months. I lasted 3 months pretending that the voicemails were a prank. and the words in the steam had been a trick of bad cork and a mind bent like light. Then a voicemail came at 2070. That was not a word, but a noise. I knew. The way the body knows the voice that speaks your name in a crowd. The boiler's cough, the small wet catch right before a flame chooses not to light, followed by the kind of quiet that buildings die into. I put on boots and grabbed my coat and was out the door before the sensible part of me could chain itself to the couch. The taxi driver said nothing. The bridge wore a shawl of fog. 4B's block smelled like pennies. The lobby lights were all on but wrong, too bright. The warmth wrung out of them. On the stairwell wall, a streak of soot climbed like handwriting from a child who can't yet make letters but can make a line. The basement door was open with no sign. Inside, the heat was offensive and useless, and the boiler sat squat and murderous with a panel open like a mouth. The fluorescent tubes hummed, one steady pitch that sounded too much like emergency. Me, the wall said. And this time, the syllable didn't belong to my voice. It belonged to the building in the clean, awful way of ownership. I went to the boiler because no one else was moving, and I remembered the breaker that clicked down, up, like a blink. It is contemptible how easily you can decide you know what to touch in a room that can kill you. I put my hand where a different version of me had put his hand and pulled and pushed, and the breath of the room changed, and something inside the metal coughed like anger giving up, and the pitch unknotted by small degrees, and the heat relaxed from murderous to merely indifferent. The washing machine started itself and sloshed as if to prove a point. I stood there shaking, and the wall said my name in my voice again, and I accepted it in the way a person accepts a nickname they hate because love lives there too. I went upstairs because the building wanted me to. The way a dog noses you toward the place it has pushed your shoes. 4B smelled like wet copper and old toast and the heavy sweetness of dust that got hot and then ashamed. The radio lay on the floor where I must have left it in a life I remember too clearly now, and I picked it up, and the speaker purred like something that has waited a long time and been rewarded. Basement, the hiss said softly, like a bedtime word, and I said no back so quietly I would not have heard it if I had not put my ear to my own mouth. The elevator opened its door without being asked, and I stepped inside because you obey a kindness even if you suspect its source. And when the doors shut, the car began to move in a way I recognized from bad dreams, too fast and yet too slow, and the light flickered in that way that is sometimes romance and sometimes punishment, and the floor indicator gave up on numbers and just blinked, and the walls had that smell. Train cars get when someone has been crying in them. I got out on 3 by will alone, my legs a language from before language, and I stood in the hallway listening to my own name leak out from the door seams of apartments I had never entered and never would. And I understood that leaving and staying were the same shape in this building, that the loop the voice had warned me about belonged to the structure, not the speaker. You left last time, the mirror had written, which had meant, I thought, that someone, me, had caused harm by leaving. But when the power dies and the static remains, you know the truth. The poltergeist is the building's memory of you, and memory doesn't want you to leave because it has worked so hard to keep your shape. I do not know whether I saved anyone by touching the boiler or merely rescued an empty room from a dramatic end. No alarms pulled neighbors out of bed. No coughing music of people learning how lungs work in bad air. The heels upstairs were already gone from this story. The night swallowed what had almost happened and left me with the vinegar taste of adrenaline and the sticky feeling of old heat on my skin. I went back to 4B and sat on the floor with the radio in my lap and let the speaker tell me inventory. The pictures on my walls, the grains of rice in the jar, the tiny crack in the mug shaped like a map of a place I have never been and cannot find, the number of breaths between now and dawn if I breathe like a calm person. I fell asleep and I woke up and the day came on like the label that knows which way the can should face, and I packed a box and then another, and by evening the apartment contained only the ghost of me, a nail hole, a scuff, a single hair coiled near the baseboard like punctuation. I left the fork in the drawer this time and didn't look back to see if it tapped a valediction. The building did not rattle the elevator doors or grab the hem of my coat. It let me go like a hand that has been holding too long. Let's go. With fatigue that feels like grace. In the new place, I learned the kinds of quiet that belong to my life and not to walls. I learned my kettle's sigh again and the way a neighbor's laughter is not an omen. I learned to sleep with my phone in another room, and I learned to wake without checking for soot in the corners of my mouth. But the voicemails persisted, gentle and insistent and stupid with love. All static until one word. Basement. Some nights wearing my voice like a shirt it had grown into. Some nights wearing a voice my father might have had if he had gotten older than he got. Some nights wearing an accent I'll have if I live long enough to forget that I ever lived anywhere else. I have not gone back. If this were a different story, I would tell you that I returned on a night the static said something new and found a reason to forgive it. I would tell you I discovered there had been a fire once and a man had died of a bad decision or a good decision made too late, and that the building had learned to keep and warn like a woman who has loved an addict learns to keep and warn. I would tell you that I became part of the crew who listen to boilers and know when a sound means heat and when it means body. Those stories exist, but they are not mine. Mine is the one where I practice leaving well, where I accept that a place can remember me so hard that it borrows my throat to ask me to come back and fix something I broke by not being there forever. Some nights, I hold the phone and press my ear to the hiss and imagine it as surf and let my breath match it and say nothing. Some nights, I play the message on speaker and leave it on the counter while I wash dishes with the care of a person who understands that habits are the way you build guardrails for a life that has too much slope. Once, not long ago, when the message came at 9:13 like it used to in the old hours when marbles rolled upstairs and the elevator learned my eyebrows, I turned my light off and stood in the kitchen and whispered hello, and something in the new building made a noise like a tiny fork tapping a plate. And it was probably a pipe or the refrigerator deciding to do what refrigerators do. But I took it as a greeting and said goodnight to it back, and then I went to bed, and I dreamed of a stairwell that didn't end and a red light that blinked until it found me, and I woke with my name in my mouth, not like an alarm, but like a prayer. If I am honest with myself, I miss the hissing, not the fear, not the way the mirror wrote me into a scold. not the mouthless mouth on the wall saying, me, with my voice like a borrowed coat. I miss being known by a thing that can't love me the way a person can, but can hold the shape of me even after I change shape, which may be a way of saying I miss being young enough to believe that a place can be home without asking anything in return. I am older now than I was when the static started, older even than the voice that sometimes wears my future breath. And what I know is this: you say hello to the light in the morning because it's good manners. You put a fork in a drawer because that is where forks live when they are not doing their work. You answer calls only when you intend to go where they ask you to go. And you keep your voice for yourself unless you are very sure the wall that wants to borrow it will use it to say something you can live with later. When the phone rings tonight, I will let it ring. When the message waits, I will let it wait. In my kitchen, the silence will feel like not a lack, but a shape, the size of a man sitting on the floor with an unplugged radio in his lap, grateful for the kind of quiet that doesn't need anything, which is to say, the kind you have to learn how to hear. I had told myself the move was clean, a blade through the knot, a simple cut from one life into another, but that was a lie, and I knew it the first week when the voicemails kept arriving. Each one was the same recipe, static, like breathing pressed against a wall. Then my name said in a voice that was mine, but older, a rasp I hadn't earned yet, finishing with that one word, basement. I'd stopped answering unknown numbers years ago, but now I didn't even check the screen. I let the phone ring out, let it vibrate against the table like a trapped insect until it gave up. Still, I kept listening to the messages, masochist or scientist, I'm not sure which. In the new place, everything was meant to be ordinary. The paint still held its new rental smell. The carpet wore its uniform grey like a safe suit, and the stove lit without prayer. Yet, every night, when the hum of the refrigerator slipped too low or the heater clicked awake, I would feel that same vibration in my jawbone, the ghost of the static from 4B. I told myself this was a memory, a nervous system trick, but the body knows better than the brain which sounds belong and which don't. The neighbors here were quiet, anonymous. The man across the hall coughed like a machine learning its settings, and the woman above me dropped shoes at odd hours. But no one complained, no one knocked, no one asked if I was running a fan all night. For a month, I thought maybe the building had let me go, that the voicemails were the residue of a severed thread, leftover current that would burn itself out. Then came the storm. It was late February, sleet striking the windows like handfuls of pins, and the power went out just after midnight. I lit a candle, more out of habit than need, and sat on the floor listening to the wet silence outside. That's when the phone buzzed, a sharp insect noise that made the flame quiver. I didn't want to, but I pressed play. The message began with the usual hiss, then my voice in a panic I had never spoken, saying, "Don't open it." That was all. Not basement, not me, just a command. Don't open it. I put the phone down and sat with my hands flat against my knees. A minute later came the sound I had dreaded. The elevator at the end of the hall, shuddering alive, though the power was still gone. The doors grinding open with a groan of old metal. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. The way you feel someone walk into a room with their shoulders hunched to brush the walls. The candle guttered. The air thickened. and from the corner of the apartment, from the closet where I had stashed a radio I hadn't touched since the move, came a sound like paper tearing itself in half, followed by the unmistakable hiss of static. My chest clenched. I hadn't brought the radio here. I was certain. I'd left it in the basement of 4B, face down on the concrete. Yet when I opened the closet door, there it sat, cord coiled like a sleeping snake, speaker buzzing faintly though it wasn't plugged in. My hand reached before my head could stop it. I touched the knob. It was warm. Behind me, from the dark hallway outside my door, the sound of a fork tapping 3 times against the plate rang clear as bells. I shut the closet door and sat against it until morning. Morning arrived like a decision I hadn't made, and I peeled myself off the closet door, stiff and sour, and pretended coffee could rinse a night like that from the back of my teeth. And when the heater finally remembered itself and the lights woke up room by room, I went back to the closet because that is what the body does when it wants certainty. It checks the thing that heard it, and the radio was where I'd left it, smug and ordinary. The cord coiled. The speaker a dark mouth holding its breath. I carried it to the kitchen and set it on the counter and said out loud, "You don't belong here," which is the sort of sentence that sounds powerful until a fork in the drawer answers with 3 neat taps like a gavel. And my phone buzzed with a new voicemail from a number that had learned shame and refused to show its face, and I didn't play it. Not then. I put the radio in a tote bag and walked it down 3 flights to the alley and set it on the closed lid of the dumpster like a cat I hoped would take the hint. And the wind came around the corner and rearranged my hair, and I stood there waiting for drama that didn't arrive and told myself, "See." And I went back up and washed my hands and turned to the empty counter, and of course the radio was there again, damp with alley air, a single tiny grit of salt clinging to the grill like punctuation. And I laughed, not because it was funny, but because humor is a pressure valve and mine had stuck. I said basement, and the refrigerator clicked, and the bulb over the sink brightened, and the heater sighed in a way that made me think of an old dog changing position. And I realized the old script was traveling on the new walls, the building trying my words on to see what they fit. I played the voicemail then because refusing was a costume I didn't have the energy to wear anymore, and the static on this one sat low like fog, and my voice came through careful. Not the panic of the night, but the tone you use for a child you're walking past a busy street. "Don't open it." And I said what? And the radio on the counter made a sound so soft it could have been imagined, the beginning of a hiss, the first cell dividing. And then my phone pinged again with a second message less than a minute later. Only one word this time in the older voice I recognized from the worst nights. "Downstairs." The elevator hummed itself awake at the end of the hall, as if it had been listening through the door and wanted to help. And I told myself I wouldn't use it. I would take the stairs, as if virtue could thicken air. But when I stepped out, the elevator door was already open, like a mouth that had been practicing my name. The basement of the new building smelled different, detergent and warm dust, and the metallic sweetness of old water. No boiler cough here, just the quiet throb of machines that had not yet grown their opinions. The fluorescent lights didn't flicker. They hummed a steady sea that flattened thought, and the corridor of storage cages sat neat with padlocks and anonymous treasures. Bicycles you age out of, Christmas bins that promise to make next year easier, a crib folded like an apology. My phone vibrated in my pocket twice in quick succession, and I ignored it, because ignoring is still a way of praying, and at the end of the corridor, a painted door I had never noticed before held a red tag in a plastic sleeve. Do not open except by authorized personnel. And the word open in that sentence shone like an invitation under black light. And the radio in my bag, the radio I had not brought and could not discard, began to warm through the fabric like a small fever. I put the tote down and said, without planning, I heard you. And a ceiling pipe above me knocked twice in deliberate rhythm, and from somewhere behind the painted door came a faint breath of air that had been trapped a long time and forgotten the etiquette of going around people. I stood there longer than makes sense, hand hovering in that space where impulse lives, the same space that sent a man up a ladder once to do a simple thing the wrong way, and the voicemail climbed out of my pocket and into my ear without being played and said again, don't open it. And in that moment, I knew the voice wasn't warning me from malice or from control. It was doing what the old building had finally learned to do, keeping the kind of keeping that is boundary and not prison. And I stepped back and nodded at a door that did not need the dignity of my nod. Maintenance came later, of course. Men in city green with radios and a toolkit walked down the hall with professional boredom and carted into the door and propped it and did not die. And I understood, watching from the corner of my eye, that what I had been told not to open was not danger like explosion, but danger like memory. Something that would have linked me too cleanly to a loop I had promised myself I would not keep walking. You learn the manners of haunting by failing them once. I took the radio upstairs because pretending I didn't own it was another kind of lie, and I set it on the kitchen counter and said, let's count. And I began to say the words that had comforted the first building into contour. Window, open, blinds, lift, water, off, light, on, me, here. And the static came thin at first, like a faraway station climbing a hill, and then steadier, and in the hiss, a new voice tried itself. Mine, yes, but roughened with a day I had not yet lived, and together we made inventory, the old language of custody dressed in new paint, and the room settled its shoulders. For a few weeks, it was almost easy. The elevator anticipated me but did not insist. The stove light came on when I raised my eyebrows, but only laughed about it. The fork in the drawer learned a quiet tap that meant I'm listening and used it sparingly. The voicemails changed too, less command and more check-in, my voice saying small domestic acts back to me as if to keep me on a channel. Water, keys, lock, sleep. I told no one. I unpacked. I hung a picture on a nail that had been sunk by someone with a better eye than mine, and said thank you to the wall, and felt stupid and felt better anyway. The trouble arrived with heat, not weather heat, but human heat. The kind that rolls out of bodies stacked in an elevator during commute and hangs in a stairwell after feet have left. And in that thickness, the static took on harmonics I didn't recognize, voices on voices, the sound of a crowd trying to be one thing, and the radio on my counter began to pick up not just me, but those others, old messages, half heard through floors, a woman in 3A saying the baby's name over and over until it became meaning without sound, an older man reciting directions as if he could drive his memory from one place to another by talking to it the whole way, a boy letting a ball fall, roll, fall, roll. The old marble Bible story modernized to a rubber thud at 9:13. Each night that made my jaw ache with nostalgia I knew wasn't mine, and woven through all that the staple of my name again, Aiden like a seam, my voice calling from a distance I had not yet traveled. The building was learning me fast because I was teaching it without intending to, the way you teach a stray your habits by pretending it isn't yours. On a Wednesday, the smoke detector blinked red in the old pattern. 2, 1, 2, 1. As if finding me across buildings like a lost friend at a party. And I stood on a chair and pressed its button and said, "Not now." And from the hall, a fork answered with a single tap like a wink, and my phone vibrated with a voicemail that would not sit patiently. It pressed play in my hand, and my voice came through hoarse with a kind of grief I had not earned yet. "Please." Then a sound like a door slamming in water, then silence. You can't live like that forever. You can endure it a while, because endurance is what bodies were built for, but living is different. I went downstairs with the radio under my arm, and I did not go to the red tag door. I turned into the laundry room and set the radio on top of the dryer and fed quarters into a machine. I didn't need, because sometimes you have to give a room a job to make it behave. And I watched the drum spin empty and listened to the hiss climb within the old metal into words that were not mine, not exactly, more plural, like being called by your nickname in a crowd and hearing not just your name but everyone who ever used it inside it. And the radio said keep, and it said me, and then it did something I had not let it do before. It fell quiet without being told, and in that little pocket of silence I understood that what it wanted wasn't ownership, it wanted routine. It wanted to be counted and to count, to be named in the same breath as the objects that know us best. Key, light, door, me. So I built a ritual. Every night at 9, I stood in the kitchen with the radio unplugged and said inventory as prayer. Window, shut. Stove, off. Key, bowl, door, latched. Me, here. And the hiss would answer with a little exhale like satisfaction. And the fork would tap twice, and the elevator would open and then close again, as if to demonstrate restraint, and the smoke detector would blink in that old time, but soften its insistence. And for a while, my voicemails were empty or kind, small thunderstorms of sound that passed without rain. The storm that ended this truce was the obvious kind. Summer broke itself against the city in heat, and then in thunder that split the blocks into old bone. And the power died first in the garage, then in the hallway, then in apartments like islands going out on a map, and the elevator shuddered to a halt between floors with a full cargo of breath, and I could hear the shape of strangers' fear through the vents, like listening to the ocean through a shell. And my phone lit with the older voice of me saying basement, and then, with a strange patience, don't open it. And a new voice I hadn't heard yet, thin and bright with youth, layered beneath, a child learning my name, as if practicing it for when it mattered. I took the stairs, and the radio took me, because I was holding it. And in the glow of emergency lights, the world looked like a rehearsal for a worse world. And the red tag door at the end of the hall pulsed with its own importance, as if lit from inside by a heart. A cluster of tenants gathered there, 3 men and a woman in a robe, all wanting to be useful. And one had a key card he had bought online. Silly little trick for sneaking into rooftops, he said. and he reached toward the latch with the confidence desperation breeds, and the radio in my arms burned like a stove eye, and the hiss in my ear said no, with my father's voice that I barely remember, and with my own older breath, and with a chorus of somebody else's rules. And I heard myself say don't, and the word landed like a hand on his wrist, and he stopped, and he hated me for it, for a full second. And then, from behind the door, came the sound of pressure, equalizing, and every light in the hall flickered, and the emergency exit opened at the far end, and a maintenance man I had never seen appeared with a bag like a doctor in a movie, and carded into the door, and shouted back down the hall, "Nobody touch anything." And we didn't. And the world narrowed to the hum of machinery that had been waiting to be allowed to help. And the elevator groaned and then sighed long. And somewhere above us, a child who had been holding his own noise like a full glass let it go and cried, and the radio cooled under my hand the way a living thing cools when fear leaves it. After they freed the people in the elevator, and the maintenance man told us in gentle lies that we had done the right thing simply by waiting, the woman in the robe touched the radio and said, "Is that what made you say it?" And I said yes, because explaining would have built a scaffold I would have had to live on forever. And she nodded, because most people will go with a story that offers them a place to put their gratitude. I took the stairs back up, and the radio felt lighter, and I sat it on the counter and said, "Window, shut, water, off, me, here." And the static answered with a sound I had not heard from it before, something small and pleased, and my voicemail blinked once more, and the message inside was only one word: not basement, not don't, not me, just keep. And I said okay, and meant it in the way that feels like pulling a blanket over a sleeping child, a tenderness that is work. And the building began to know me not as a leaving, but as a keeping. And in that knowledge, it eased its grip on my name. Weeks later, I walked past my old street and did not go in, and did not listen for a fork, and did not press my ear to a wall. I only stood on the far side of the block and looked at the windows of 4B and said under my breath, "Hello," like a person greeting an ex they wish well. And the air did not change, the elevator did not open, the world did not hinge. And I went home to the new building where the smoke detector blinks kindly, and the elevator waits its turn, and the radio sits on the counter like a pet that has learned the door opens at 9, and each night I speak the language we built: window, shut, lock, turn, light, off, me, here. And the static hums its amen in return. And if sometimes the older voice of me calls at 2:07 to say basement in a tone that knows more than I do, I let it go to voicemail, and I listen in the morning when the light is honest and the room is mine, and I whisper back to both buildings and to all the walls that learned me, "I'm here, I kept it." And the day says, "Okay," and opens. Days stacked into weeks the way bricks stack into walls, without ceremony, but with weight. And I found myself drifting into the rhythm of a life that felt almost ordinary again, though ordinary meant something different now. Ordinary meant waking each morning with the faintest buzz in my jaw like a leftover dream. Ordinary meant pausing at the closet to be sure the radio still sat where I had left it, silent but present, as if it were waiting for me to remember it. Ordinary meant answering the nightly roll call of objects: window, shut, door, latched, me, here, and hearing the static breathe back like a choir of dust. Some nights it was enough. Some nights I believed myself safe. But the building, this new one, had its own way of testing boundaries. The first real crack came on a Tuesday in late autumn, when the fire alarm shrieked us all out into the hallway at 2 a.m. Not a drill, but not a fire either. Just one of those electrical spasms that means nothing until it does. I stood with the rest of them, bare feet, half asleep. A dozen strangers unified by inconvenience, and as I leaned against the wall, I felt it, the hum. Not from the alarm, not from the pipes, but from the bones of the building itself. The radio in my apartment was humming through the drywall, spilling into the corridor. Nobody else seemed to hear it, their eyes glassy with exhaustion, but to me, it was deafening. When the alarm cut off at last and the crowd shuffled back inside, I walked straight to the kitchen and found the radio glowing faintly, its dial lit like an eye. I hadn't touched it in days. I whispered, "What?" and the hiss shifted, words dragging themselves out of the noise like a body through mud. "We're here." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor with my back against the cabinets, watching the radio, listening as the voices braided together. Mine, older, younger, rougher, all speaking my name, all telling me pieces of instructions too scattered to follow. At dawn, I carried it to the balcony and set it down on the cold concrete. But when I went back inside, the static stayed in the walls, whispering through the vents, the refrigerator, even the gentle swing of the heating system. It had grown past the box. The days after blurred. I walked through the city with earbuds in, but the hiss slid beneath the music, sinking itself to my footsteps. The elevator carried on, anticipating me, doors sighing open as I arrived, and once when I hesitated, the lights inside pulsed in that old SOS pattern, and I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it, nearly cried too, because how long can a person pretend they are not fluent in a language they have already learned? My phone filled with voicemails again, not the blunt basement or don't, but smaller words, stranger words, keep, write, count, stay. They were not threats, they were requests, please. One evening I tried an experiment. I left the radio unplugged on the counter and sat across from it with a notebook open. I said aloud, "Tell me," and waited. The static rose and fell, jagged, patient. I wrote what I thought I heard: door, breath, hold, name. I turned the page and it continued. Me, remember, me. My handwriting looked like someone else's by the time I stopped, lines uneven, letters shaky. When I put the pen down, the radio fell silent, and the quiet was worse than the noise. It hasn't left me. I don't think it ever will. The old building claimed me, this one is studying me, and somewhere between them I have become a vessel for their keeping. Nights I lie awake with the notebook on my chest, hearing the faint hum climb through the floorboards, feeling the weight of the radio like a heartbeat in the room, and every so often, just as I drift towards sleep, the static sharpens into my own voice, steady, insistent, saying the one thing that is always the same. I'm here, and each time, without meaning to, I whisper it back. The last days of that winter blurred into a long grey corridor, each morning spilling into the next with the same tired light through the same tired blinds, but the radio never let me forget it was there. I stopped trying to throw it out. I stopped pretending it belonged anywhere but on the counter, a roommate without a name. The messages kept coming, sometimes twice a night, sometimes not for days, but always with that same rhythm. Static, like breath. Then my own voice pulling through, older, stranger, warning me or asking me, keep, count, stay, remember. I wanted to believe I could ignore it, but the body knows when it's being listened to. The hair on my arm stood at odd hours. My jaw buzzed faintly when I passed certain walls. Even the silence felt sculpted around me. One night, the storm came harder than the others. Thunder rolling through the city like an old machine, and the rain lashing the glass until it seemed the windows would bow inward. The power died again, not suddenly, but piece by piece, each lamp sighing out until only the candle I kept on the table remained. I sat with the radio in front of me, its cord dangling useless, the speaker faintly vibrating as if waiting for its cue. The voicemail came before the phone had even rung. Static first, then my voice, calm but insistent. Don't open the door. I stared at the apartment door across the room, the deadbolt bright in the candlelight. Another voicemail landed, another version of me, younger this time, whispering basement. And then a third, my voice but ragged, desperate, keep the light, keep the light, keep the light. The air grew heavy. I heard footsteps in the hall, though no one had left their apartments. Soft, deliberate, like boots carrying weight. The elevator at the end of the corridor whined itself awake. Though I knew the power was still gone, my pulse hammered so hard I thought it might knock over the candle. The radio hissed louder, shaping sound into something closer to a chant. Dozens of versions of my own voice layered, overlapping, filling the room. Me, 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 me. It wasn't begging. It wasn't threatening. It was a demand, a claiming. I stood. I don't remember choosing to, but my body moved. I walked to the door, hand reaching toward the lock. The radio's chant grew sharper, almost jubilant. And in that moment, I remembered the ladder, the old man, the word carved into the ledger that wasn't mine. If the light goes out, we will keep it in the window so he will know the way. And I realized this was not just about me. It had never been just about me. Buildings remember, rooms remember, and sometimes they use you as their mouth. My hand hovered over the deadbolt. The candle guttered low, and I whispered back, I'll keep it, I'll keep it. At that, the radio went silent. The footsteps in the hall stopped. The elevator shut itself with a sigh. The power came back in a stuttering wave, light snapping on, refrigerator humming alive, the bulb over the sink flaring so bright I had to shield my eyes. When I turned back, the radio was dark, ordinary, mute. It hasn't spoken since, but some nights, when the wind bends through the alley just right, I hear the faintest hiss in the walls. My jaw vibrates like a tuning fork, and I know it's listening. I know it's keeping me as surely as I'm keeping it. I don't fight it anymore. I don't run. At 9 each night, I say my inventory like a prayer. Window shut, stove off, keys in the bowl, door latched, me here. And the silence that follows is not empty. It's acknowledgement. I don't know if this is haunting or covenant. I don't know if I've been claimed or if I've been made a keeper. I only know that the radio waits, the buildings remember, and the voices inside the static are mine and not mine, past and future, warning and promise, all bound into the same hum. And when I close my eyes at last, drifting towards sleep, I hear it again, softer than breath, steady as a heartbeat. I'm here, and before the dark can swallow me, I always answer, I'm here too. I moved into the farmhouse at the end of October because no one else wanted it before winter, and because I had run out of reasons to keep negotiating with a city that mistook noise for music and the agent called the sagging porch character, with a brightness that made me forgive her a little, though the porch had more than character. It had a ceiling light that refused to turn off, a stubborn coin of amber that hummed just at the frequency that makes your molars feel like they came with warranties. And the first night the swing moved in a shallow arc without wind, the way your hand might move if you were testing air before plunging it into water, and a mason jar on the rail chattered against the wood like a tooth, and in the morning the nails on the top step had shifted a quarter turn, all of them, their grooves misaligned like a smile that wasn't sure if it was allowed. I thought of loose boards and old wiring and said out loud to the empty road that I wasn't afraid of a light bulb. And the bulb brightened almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging my manners. Inside, the house was a catalogue of small insistences. Cans in the pantry rotated so their labels faced forward. A string above the kitchen door tied itself into neat loops like a dress rehearsal for a bow. The hallway runner centered itself over the seams in the floorboards, and when I tried to cut the string, the porch light went milk white, fogging with a cataract skin and humming high until my fingers remembered they were attached to me and set down the scissors, and I apologized, and the film cleared as if it had only wanted to be heard. The closest neighbor, a man with the slow, rolling gait of someone who spends more time on ground than in buildings, spat tobacco into the weeds and told me that the sheriff had said to leave the porch light alone, that an old man named Jonas had gone up a ladder to change it, broke his neck, took them an hour to find him because his wife had gone to town for feed and his daughter had been sent to check on a neighbor's cows that had gotten into the creek, and by the time anyone noticed, the bulb was still burning and the ladder was on its side like a fallen letter. The old man was past noticing anything. The neighbor said after that the light never went out, and the sheriff said certain things aren't worth arguing with because they already won. And he gave me a slow, measuring look as if to loan me some caution I might not yet own, then turned and let the field take him back. I brought a step stool out anyway, because sometimes you have to touch the fence to believe the pasture is electrified, and I told the night and the jar and the swing and the humming bulb that I was just dusting, and the light climbed into a whine that threaded my fillings like a thin wire, and the air smelled briefly of ozone and warm dust and the way old televisions used to smell when they'd been on too long, and I climbed down and said, okay, okay, and the swing made a sound that could have been a chain settling or the house approving. After that, I stopped pretending I was dealing with quirks. I was living with a preference, a set of rules, and the rules had a personality. If I left my boots on the mat with toes pointing out, the swing would scrape softly in its brackets until I got up and turned them in. If I hung the porch thermometer a finger width too high, I'd wait to find it re-hung exactly 5 feet from the floor, as if it were measuring a child who'd earned the inch. If I stacked the firewood in lazy columns that leaned like drunks, I'd find them in the morning in right-angled chords so true they could have taught geometry. The light itself was not only light, it was breath, a held note threaded through the wood, a way for the house to speak without breaking anything. I began to talk to it, the way you talk to an old dog who knows your steps, kept my voice low and my words simple. You aren't the light, I said one evening, you're breathing through it. And the hum softened, and the swing shushed to stillness, and the jars stopped trembling as if some lesson had been correctly recited. November does what it wants in that part of the county. Rain slapped the windows like a bored friend and left. Fog pressed its forehead to the glass. A skiff of early snow rehearsed the shape of drifts to come, and the porch light stayed on waking, on sleeping. On the nights I drank too much and felt honest. On the mornings my phone flashed the city name, and I let it ring out. And in the pantry the labels kept turning to face me like students who wanted credit for attendance, and a string above the kitchen door learned new knots I didn't know the names for, intricate little hands that looked like they belonged on a boat. And when I brought a book of knots home from the library, the string tried one of the easier ones while I watched and spoiled the satisfaction of pretending I didn't care. One afternoon, the neighbor brought me a dozen eggs with shells speckled like river stones and told me without being asked the rest of what he knew, which was not much. Jonas's wife had a name like Ruth or Ethel or Elsie. They had 2 boys and a girl. The girl had the kind of laugh you could hear through trees. The boys had the kind of feet you could hear on stairs. And after Jonas fell, the family stayed a while and then didn't. Because grief makes houses too big, he said. And he looked up at the light as he said it like a farmer checking a sky for truth. And I said thank you for the eggs, and we stood with that egg carton silence between us that belongs to people who can talk about weather and not about why they are both standing on the same porch full of something neither brought. That night, I set my boots toes in without prompting. I left the thermometer alone, and I placed a mason jar on the rail with the wide lip pointed toward the field. And the light's hum changed, higher but not mean, curious the way a calf noses your hand. And I told the empty yard the piece I had been pretending was a coincidence. I had not come here only for quiet. I had come because I had failed at making a life that didn't require me to apologize for needing lamps left on. And the house hummed back, not in sympathy, but in comprehension, like a ledger nodding at arithmetic. The first big snow came like a rumor and stayed like a relative. Fat flakes the size of moths. The roof shedding its burdens with soft thuds, trees bowing and then deciding humility wasn't for them. And the kettle on the stove cried and the porch bulb matched it, the hum rising into a thin shimmering that made the hair on my arms lift, and the swing clicked its chain in time like a metronome with an opinion. And I put on my coat and stood with 1 foot in and 1 foot out and asked, not politely and not with a dare, just asked, what do you want? And the mason jars on the rail began to rattle and rotate until all 3 mouths aimed at the doorframe. And I looked and saw carved and recarved and worn to softness. Strikes and fives and initials at levels that told a story of up, knee-high, chest-high, taller than your father if you stood on your toes, the kind of marks you keep even when paint begs for a blank slate. And the light bloomed so bright the snow became paper, and the swing stilled, and the room behind me creaked as a room does when it remembers laughter at a height it can no longer contain. You had a family, I said, and inside a magnet slid slowly down the fridge like a nod, and that was the first time the hum felt like grief and not just force. That night I dreamed of moths filling the bulb like confetti in a glass throat, wings making weather, a warm thrum that traveled through my jawbone into my brain, and when I woke, the porch was full of them. A gentle blizzard, brown and ash and cream, bodies never touching me and yet brushing my senses. arranging themselves in an orbit around the bulb, and they tapped with their soft bodies against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. A pattern. And I didn't know Morse code, but something in my hands did. The way a childhood game knows your wrist even when you forget the rules, and I wrote down the taps and the pauses on a receipt and looked them up later. Stay, then watch, then fall, and then, after a conference that took longer and looked like rain, sorry. And I laughed once with my face and once with my chest, and then I went to get the step stool because it was time to say it back. I did not touch the bulb. I touched the metal collar at its base, the part a man grips when he means to turn and sometimes turns the wrong way with cold hands, and I said, I forgive you, and a drift slid off the roof like a shrug, and the hum softened to a purr you could mistake for quiet if you were unkind. In the morning, the light was off, just off, the porch, suddenly a place where darkness belonged to night instead of to temperament, the swing limp as if it had worked a full shift and been sent home. A line of moths asleep on the rail like collars. The house wearing the relief of someone whose apology was accepted even if it changed nothing else. I wrote a note in pencil on the door frame where the Heights lived. I'll keep the light, and I meant I will keep what it means, not I will keep it on. And the house understood, and nothing slammed for the first time in weeks. The story could have ended there if I were the kind of person who knows when to stop touching a fence, but forgiveness has a corollary, and it is curiosity. And curiosity wanted to know who Jonas had been when he was not a ladder and a fall, wanted to know if Elsie or Ruth had learned to sleep with the light off, wanted to know whether the children had come back to count their lines on holidays. I drove to the county office where a woman with hair like a crown of pencil shavings let me turn the book and rustle the old paper. And I found a deed from 1952 and a tax letter with the name Jonas G. Harnett in patient capital letters that looked like they had been taught by a man with a ruler. And I found a marriage announcement for Elspeth Ruth in a column that smelled faintly of mildew and weddings. And in the library, I found a photograph clipped from a church bulletin of 3 children holding lanterns at dusk in front of a building that could have been my porch if you gave it 20 fewer winters. And the boy on the left had a cowlick that made me smile, and the girl had a mouth you could hear through trees, and it was nothing and everything. And when I brought the copies home and set them on the kitchen table, the magnet on the fridge scooted a hair toward the edge and stopped, undecided. The house acclimated to quiet the way lakes do when wind leaves. The can stayed forward without aggressive corrections. The string above the kitchen door tied knots only when I watched and left them in place. The thermometer stayed at 5 feet as if height were not a fight, and I learned the schedules of deer and the shift change of crows and the way the mailman's truck sounds different when he has bad news. And I learned the habits of the hum in its absence. I'd catch my jaw searching for it, like a tongue finds a missing tooth. Winter got serious, the kind of serious that closes roads and teaches men humility. And for a week, the world reduced to white, and the window learned my shape in fog each morning, and my coffee tasted like thinking. And then, on a night sharp enough to cut with, the light came on again all at once, not bright, but present. A coin dropped on a table in a quiet bar. A hello that wasn't a question, and the hum was different, lower, and the swing drifted just enough to brush snow from the top step like a housekeeping instinct. And I said out loud, without moving, "You don't have to," and the bulb continued, and the hum didn't change, and I understood that this wasn't a relapse, it was a ritual. The next day, the neighbor stopped at the road gate and waved me down and told me in his unhurried way that he had been at the feed store when Elsie, he said it that way, with certainty, had come in after the fall, still wearing her coat though it was warm in there, and bought a battery lantern and a box of nails and a ledger, and she had written everything for a month like writing could keep things from disappearing if she pinned them to paper, and that sometimes, he said, a light isn't a light. It's a promise you make to the dark that you won't pretend it isn't real. And he said this without poetry and without needing me to admire the sentence, and I nodded like a person being told how to brace a wall. I started to feel the house in my bones the way you feel a barn settling in your knees. I could tell when the porch wanted sweeping, not from the sight of it, but from some small tightness in the hum of the rail. I could feel when a storm was coming because the jars went still as if listening. I could tell when I had been sloppy because the labels in the pantry grew a single degree more assertive, and around that time I started smelling kerosene that wasn't there and hearing the quiet clap of a book shutting in a room with no books. And on a Tuesday I woke to sugar on the porch rail, a fine sift like hoarfrost, and when I touched it and tasted it because I am either brave or foolish, I thought of weddings and coffee and ordinary kindnesses, and the hum rose once and subsided, and I wrote with my finger, "Thank you," and the sugar blew into a tiny white weather and was gone. Not every sign was sweetness. One evening, I tried to carry the ladder out of the shed, not to change anything but to clean the gutters before ice made a permanent decision, and the light sharpened so suddenly my eyes watered and the swing jerked in 1 irritated centimeter, and somewhere in the house a nail squealed in its wood, and I set the ladder down and waited and said, "I hear you," and moved the ladder back, and the house exhaled, and I took the snow rake instead, and the roof gave up its trash without complaint, and I thought of rules, not as bars, but as guardrails, not as punishment, but as a hand on your shoulder saying, "Slow down, think." I learned Morse properly because once you've been tapped at by moths, you feel rude not knowing the language, and I practiced at night with a little flashlight cupped in my palm, and the first time I spelled "hello" back to the porch light, it dimmed and brightened in 3 careful pulses like a student pleased with a quiz. And on the glass, though I can't explain it, a cloudiness pattered in little dots invisible unless you were looking, and the pattern spelled "OK" in a hand I would have recognized even in another century. A thaw came, and then a freeze that stole everything the thaw had promised, and then a wind that worried at the roof tin like a habit, and one midnight the hum jumped high and thin, and the bulb went hard, bright, and the swing banged hard enough to snatch me upright, and the jars rattled, and there was a noise inside like someone dragging a rake down the hallway, and I was at the door with my coat half on before sense made any suggestion, and when I opened the door, the cold stepped in, and behind it was a sound I knew too well from the old city, the slick, ambitious footsteps of someone who believes they are the only person awake. And I said whatever I said in the voice I keep for emergencies, and the light hit a pitch that had no business coming from a household object, and the swing whipped to the left and then right, and the jars hopped and fell and rolled to the edge of the steps and went off like little glass frogs, and out there near the drive a figure stuttered, paused, and then broke off into the dark, and the light held its brightness until the sound was gone and then stalled down, and I stood in my socks on cold boards and felt the way gratitude can live in the same house as fear and not argue with it. In the morning, there were prints in the snow by the drive that didn't belong to me or the neighbor or the deer, and I swept them with a broom until the path was just path again. And when I turned back, the jar that had rolled and not broken sat upright on the rail without my help, water inside it clear as good memory, and the light was off and the swing was still, and I said thank you, and the string over the kitchen door tied a tidy bow. Late winter took its time being done. It fretted and backed up and then committed all at once, and the yard turned to a species of mud that remembers what it will become but isn't ready, and the world smelled of thawed rot and hope. And on a day when the sun was less stingy, the light was on at noon, and I sat on the step and told it what I had learned in its company, that rules can be love, that apology can be a door, that keeping watch is work you choose, not a sentence imposed. And I told it what I knew about Jonas now, not from papers but from the way the hum went old when I said his name, that he had been careful until he wasn't, that grief had a perimeter you could trip, that a fall is not only a body going down but a promise broken at speed. And I said his name again like I was telling the house I would help carry it, and the hum smoothed so tenderly I found myself blinking at nothing. In April, I found a small tin under the porch with nails sorted by size, coffee can lids flattened and stacked, a folded paper bearing the measurements of a room I recognized, written in pencil, that had been taught by a man with a ruler. And I set the tin on the kitchen table and laid the paper out and put my palm over the figures as if I could learn them into my hand. And that night the light came on, though I hadn't asked anything, and I understood it not as a demand but as a nod to work we would do in the morning that had waited longer than any work should wait. I built shelves for the pantry steady enough to carry the labels without correction. I planed a stubborn door that had been complaining in winter air for a decade. I rehung the screen with hinges that didn't squeal, and with every finished thing the hum stepped back slightly, not leaving, just making room. Sometimes I caught myself missing the insistence, the way the house had corrected me into its shape, and sometimes the light came on at odd hours, as if to remind me that love isn't love if it stops watching. And in those moments, I'd sit and let the hum run through my bones until my blood remembered the beat. Spring gave way to a summer that smelled like a fair and a garage. Cut grass and oil and rain cooked off gravel. The crickets tried their long arithmetic, and lightning shouldered the horizon 3 nights out of 7, and twice the bulb took a hit directly, not a strike, but a shout, and wavered and held, and I said easy, the way you do to a horse you haven't earned yet, and it steadied, and the swing, which had always kept time for other things, now kept time for itself sometimes. Just a private little sway, as if it liked living. I kept the pencil by the door frame and took to adding tiny notes between the old height marks, not measurements of inches, but of days. Good rain, first fawn, neighbor brought peaches, storm passed us by, and once, after I had sat on the steps and said out loud to nobody that the city had not been a mistake, but a chapter with an end, I wrote forgiven in letters small enough that they felt like a secret, and the next morning a moth slept exactly under the word, a comma in a sentence I wanted to keep writing. In autumn, because seasons turn even when you would rather they pause, I found myself worrying the way farm people do as light shortens, counting wood as if numbers guarantee warmth, testing the generator, talking to the house with new urgency, and the light came on more often, not in alarm, but as if warming up a choir, and the hum went down into itself like a cat arranging its paws. And on the anniversary of the first night, the shine of the porch light in that big October dark, I baked a cake because rituals need sugar as much as they need words, and I sliced a small piece and left it on a plate on the rail as I had seen people do in other countries and other stories. And the next morning, the cake looked exactly the same except for a single moth print pressed into the frosting like a seal. And I ate the cake for breakfast, and it tasted of something unnamed that lives between loss and keeping. I don't know what else you'd call what I had with the porch light, except a conversation, long, sometimes boring, sometimes bright. The kind of conversation you have with someone you intend to keep, even when they annoy you. It told me rules, and I told it reasons. It told me stories in hum and shift and tiny rearrangements, and I told it stories in errands and repairs and a life lived close enough to listen. And when the light stayed off for a week, I didn't panic. I put my boots in toes in and boiled the kettle and listened to the quiet for what it was, not a lack, but a choice. And when the light came back on one cold blue evening with the snow like flour in the air, and punched out 3 short pulses, I knew, without checking a book, that it was saying okay. And I tapped with my knuckles once on the rail for yes, and felt the hum reply through the wood, like a dog, thumping its tail under the table. If there is a moral, I haven't learned it well enough to preach. I only know that the porch light that wouldn't turn off when I arrived eventually taught me when to leave it off and when to let it burn. That a fall is not the only way a body can drop something. That forgiveness can be a ladder you lean correctly this time. That watching is work that changes you into someone who notices sugar on a railing and moths spelling words you already know. That houses remember the heights of children even when nobody stands there anymore. That sometimes when wind dies, the swing moves anyway and sweeps the step clean. And that on clear nights when I look up through the glass, I see wings beating against nothing, not moths now, but something that prefers not to be named, trying to tap out a word I carry without translation. And I answer with the small noises a person makes when they are home and being good. Boots turned in, breath even, light left as a promise rather than a dare. Winter came back like a story that hadn't finished telling itself, and I let it. I stacked wood the way a person stacks reasons. I kept the pencil where it belonged by the door frame and added small days to the old height marks. First fox prints across the field, the neighbor's tractor coughing alive at dawn, bread that rose and didn't fall, and the porch light behaved like a well-mannered guest until the first real ice settled over everything and turned the road into a silver thought you could only think carefully. And that week, the bulb began to speak again, not bright, not demanding, just the steady hum, stepping up into those quick pulses I had learned to read without a book. And when I stood under the eave and listened with my jaw more than my ear, I caught the old pattern threaded through a new one. Watch, fall, sorry, but also a gentler sequence with longer spaces that felt like breath. Window, keep, stay. And I said, I'm here, like you say it to a child who has woken from a dream they can't describe. And the swing moved a fraction as if relieved to be believed. The ice storm arrived at night as ice storms do, too quiet until it wasn't. The trees creaking like old ships, the line down the road beginning to hum with a low animal complaint, the world clicking as if teeth chattered around us all at once, and I sat at the kitchen table with a candle ready, though the power still held and the light above the porch held too, fierce in its little circle. And I read a page of the county history I had taken to keeping out light company and found, buried between barn raisings and flood accounts, the sentence you only see once you are living inside it. It is customary to keep a light for those who walk back from fields, and some houses do not sleep without it. And I put my thumb on that line, and the porch hum rose, not in alarm but in recognition, and then the transformer toward town blew in a blue-green cough that made the hair on my arm stand, and the house stepped into the kind of dark that is not empty but newly crowded. And the porch light, my stubborn, forgiven, instructed light, did not go out. It went on breathing, and I understood on the clean edge of fear that it was no longer a bulb at the mercy of wires. It was a mouth, it was a lung, it was the house itself keeping its promise with or without the grid's permission. The phone didn't know what to do with the night. It searched for a tower like a person searching a room for a friend too tall to hide. It gave up. It tried again. It failed in a polite way. And in that silence, I heard something else. A far-off sound, like a shovel dropped into a drift, or a door slammed against weather and then forced. And I put on my coat, because that is the body's decision before the brain can argue. And when I opened the door, the cold took a step into me, and the light leaned its hum toward the road so gently I didn't realize I was moving the way it asked, until my boots were already on the steps, and the jar on the rail shivered once and steadied as if to say, "Remember, you promised." And I did remember. I had written it on the frame where the children's lines lived. "I'll keep the light." And that vow had weight now that had nothing to do with switches. The neighbor's place sits through a thin run of woods and up a slow rise, and in ice that rise becomes a dare. And halfway there I saw the glow of my own porch in the corner of my eye, like a star. You can only see if you don't look at it directly. And ahead in the dark I heard the whine of a wheel spinning against what it couldn't grip, and the bobbing, failed pulse of a flashlight making bad choices, and I shouted his name and heard a smaller voice answer. The wrong pitch for the man I knew. The right pitch for a boy who thought he could get home before the weather changed its mind. And when I reached the ditch, the truck's nose was down like an animal that had dug itself into a story it couldn't finish. And the neighbor's grandson, he had been at the feed store. I remembered him clearly, polite and cocky in equal measure, was standing in the blown sugar of the field light without a hat, blinking like an apology. And the house behind me hummed, not because sound travels that far, but because promise does. And I did what anyone would do. Rope from the barn, the slow convincing of steel and ice, the digging with a shovel that clanged and jarred bone, the boy hauling branches where I pointed, the two of us becoming the shape of work without stopping to name our fear. And when the truck finally complied and stepped backward onto the road, the boy put his hands on his knees and laughed. That laughter people laugh after they do not die. And the porch light dipped and rose. 3 short pulses, the old okay. And I felt the reply in my teeth and said, "You're welcome," out loud to a night that didn't ask for words. We walked him back to his grandfather's door together. Me and the hum, because that is how keeping works, not once, not ceremony, but a walk in the dark with your shoulders up and your mouth breathing steam and the porch behind you, drawing a line through weather that means this is where the story returns. And when the old man opened his door, he took the boy's head in both hands without making a sound you could hear, and then looked past my shoulder in the direction of my house and lifted his chin the way men do toward other men they can accept help from. And he said, "You kept it." And I said I did. And he said she did too. And I knew he meant Elsie or Elspeth or whatever mouth the name had been given when it first entered this land. And we stood there making a triangle of warmth in a night that would have liked us to forget how. The power stayed gone for 3 days, and I lived the way the house knew I could live, with hot water from the stove and blankets that smelled like cedar, and a rhythm that matched candle stubs, and the swing moved just enough to brush frost off the step every morning. And when I spelled "thank you" with the flashlight cupped in my palm against the glass, the bulb fogged itself in the shape of a reply too gentle for letters. And on the second day of that small era, I climbed into the attic, not with a ladder against the porch, but from inside, through the hatch that sticks. Because rules do not forbid work, they forbid repeating the exact mistake. And the house accepted the compromise with that quiet recalibration you feel more than hear. Wood answering wood, like a conversation between old friends. And up there above the porch, I found what houses keep when they trust you a little. A tin with nails married to their sizes by care. A tobacco tin with 3 matches laid across its lid like bones. A scarf the color of old snowfall, and a narrow ledger wrapped in oilcloth the way you wrap a wound you intend to attend to later. And when I opened the ledger, the air changed, and I felt the attic shrink closer, as if to listen politely. And what I read was not numbers, but days. Elspeth Ruth's hand moving like a careful river. Entries that began with a light and ended without one. Jonas fell today, lad. Wrong way turned only a hair. Lantern in window till morning. Children measured, Ruth laughed, H at 5 feet, leave light as long as breath. Heard him on the step the second night, or else the storm. Do not turn your face. And the last one before the paper changed and the pencil became a woman. If the light goes out, we will keep it in the window so he will know the way. If he is only hungry for home, he can be fed. And I sat there with that sentence like bread in my hand and thought how hunger and ghosts are cousins. I brought the ledger down and set it on the kitchen table with the tin and the scarf, and the hum in the porch went low and steady as if someone slept without fear for the first time in a long time. And I did what the book asked, even though the light still breathed through the bulb. I put a lantern in the window, not because the porch needed help, but because promises deserve witnesses. And the next night the moths returned out of season. A few stubborn bodies driven by something older than weather, and tapped once on the glass and were gone. And I said aloud to the room that was listening, we are keeping this together. And it was not poetry. It was a job description. The thaw came jagged as before, then the easy mornings, then the bees, then the hay smell of late June that climbs into your shirt and stays there, and with it came a letter addressed to occupant, from a return name I didn't know until I did, because names make their own weather when they travel far enough and return. Harnett. And inside, a short, careful paragraph from a woman who said she believed her grandmother had lived here when she was a girl, that she had a photograph of a porch that looked like mine and children holding lanterns, that the family had meant to come back and didn't, that she had felt lately the oddest pull when she passed the road on the way to the lake with her own children. And might it be all right to stop by and stand in the yard where the tick marks might be? And she sent a phone number with an area code that looked like a place I had never been. And I called, and her voice had the timbre of people who speak gently because life has already shouted at them. She came on a Sunday in a car that smelled like crayons and pretzels, and she wore her hands like work, and when she stepped onto the porch, the light came on, not bright, not for display, but in that soft daylight way, as if to be seen by a single person is ceremony enough, and she put her palm to the frame without looking for permission. The way you touch the bark of a tree you climbed when you were small. And she said there, where her grandmother's pencil had paused years before, and then begun again. And she told me a piece I hadn't read anywhere because it had never been written. On the night after the fall, Elspeth had set a lantern in the window and sat in the rocker with the children, sleeping in a pile in front of the stove, and had said, if he is only lost, he will see the light, and if he is gone, he will see it anyway and know that we kept what he asked us to, and the porch had kept it for them after they could not keep it for themselves. And the woman, her name was Marion, laughed a little and cried a little, and said she had driven with her kids past here 3 summers in a row, and the oldest had asked if they could live in the house with the wakeful porch. And you don't tell a child why not. You tell them about schools and distance and money, and then you keep driving and hope the pull is a thread and not a chain. We made coffee and stood on the steps with our cups, and she told me the names of the children in the church. Bulletin clipping I kept in a drawer. Harlan, Ruthie, Tom. And when she stood her 2 boys under the frame and made the little mark you make when you mean to remember a year, the hum went down beneath hearing and settled under our feet like a good foundation, and the swing moved once as if to make a space beside it for someone who would sit later and understand the grammar of ropes. She asked me, in the voice of someone who knows you will say yes, if she could come back someday when the leaves turned, and I said yes. And she asked if it would be all right to bring a bulb her grandmother had kept in a box for reasons no one remembered. And I said we can keep it, even if we don't use it. And she put the boys in the car and waved, and the car turned its noise into smaller and smaller sound until the field took it. And I stood with the house in our usual quiet and felt how rooms can make room for more. Late summer rolled toward harvest, and the nights found their edge again. And in that edge, I began to feel the light, considering me as much as I had considered it. And one evening, when the wind lacked patience, and the walnut tree threw green shells like opinions, and the jars on the rail agreed with themselves, the bulb breathed bright and then low, and then bright again, and the pattern wasn't code I knew. It was a stutter, like someone taking off a heavy coat and putting it back on in the same movement. And I said, "What do you need?" And the attic hatch whispered. The scarf on the chair shifted. The ledger's page patted itself shut as if not to intrude, and I understood that there are rituals for lighting and rituals for letting go. And maybe this was a house asking for permission to be tired, and I said, "You may rest," and the hum dropped a note and held it like a choir, finding the pitch of amen. The ceremony, if that's what it was, happened without planning, which is the best kind. The neighbor arrived with a jar of pickles and said it felt like a night to sit a minute. The boy came with him, and stood with his hands in pockets, trying not to look like someone who had been pulled from a ditch by light. Marion's car appeared at the gate as if it had turned on its own, her boys running already toward the swing, and we all found places without arrangement while the son thought about leaving and decided to do it slowly for our sake. And I brought the lantern and set it in the window and struck a match, and the flame climbed with the small bravery of fire and took its place. And the porch light glowed not in competition, but in harmony. And for a while, we were a shape that made sense on boards, that had held heartbreak and groceries and muddy boots and the weight of men too proud to sit. And when the dark finally laid its hand across the field, the bulb brightened once, then softened, then brightened and softened again. And I reached up, not with a ladder, but from the attic, feet planted on joists that knew me, fingers on the collar the way I had touched it the night I said, "I forgive you." And I did not turn it because we had learned that turning can be a mistake. I only rested my hand and the light went warm, and then warmer, and then quiet. And the hum stayed as hum, not gone, just moved deeper, a heartbeat in wood you can only hear if you lie down and put your ear to the floor. And in the window, the lantern kept its small appointment with the dark, and the moths came and wrote nothing. And that was the point. We did not say words over it because some work is not for tongues. The boy looked skyward as if the light had gone there, and maybe it had. The neighbor took the scarf between his fingers and nodded as if greeting a friend across a street. Marion's youngest traced his finger over the pencil marks as if the old heights could grow again. And I felt the house notice us as one body for a moment, and the swing, without breeze, moved once like punctuation you cannot teach. And we stood there being people who had chosen to stand where they stood. And after a time we went inside and ate cake without ceremony, and laughed too loudly, and talked about the price of hay and what to do with the apples, and whether the fence on the east side would hold another winter. And nobody thanked the light, because gratitude had already been spoken in the language of being willing to come when called. After that night, the porch learned a new way to keep me, softer, less supervisory. The labels in the pantry faced forward because I wanted them to. The string above the kitchen door tied a knot only when I was looking and wanted to learn it. The thermometer stayed at 5 feet, not as rule, but as reminder. And when storms came, the lantern did its job, and the hum stayed low and calm, and the swing swept the step clean, as if remembering a duty and deciding it was still worth doing. And sometimes on clear nights, if I leaned back and looked up through the glass, I would see wings again. Not moths, and not anything I could be arrogant enough to name. Beating against nothing and spelling nothing I could translate, and yet telling me everything I needed to know about what it means to keep a promise long after anyone is measuring. And on those nights, I would say into the boards and the rails and the nail heads and the empty ladder hooks, I will keep the light, by which I meant I will keep the keeping, and the house would answer in the only way houses can, by continuing to stand around my mistakes and hold my sleep and hum low with the pleasure of being understood. Autumn slid into itself like a knife into warm earth, and I let it. The fields thinning, the woods turning into their own fire, the porch rail cool enough in the mornings to shock my hands, and the light that had once been constant now chose its appearances carefully. A pulse at dusk when the crows wheeled ragged toward their roosts. A soft glow when the air carried smoke from neighbors burning off brush. Sometimes, not at all for nights at a time, as though testing whether I would panic or trust. And I found that I did not panic anymore. I kept the lantern ready, and I learned to believe in absence as much as presence. The ledger sat on my kitchen table under a plate of fruit, like a guest too polite to leave, and some nights I read from it aloud, the words not dramatic but steady, the small lists of chores and weather that made a life, and I could feel the hum in the floorboards rise and fall as if the house remembered them line by line. Marion wrote again and then called, her voice steadier now. She said her boys talked about the porch as though it were a relative. They had drawn pictures of it at school when asked to draw home. She asked if she might come by at Thanksgiving with her mother, and I said yes, though the thought of more people stepping into that hum made me nervous in the way you get nervous introducing friends who matter too much to fail each other. When they came, the older woman held herself like she was bracing against wind, though the air was still. She walked slow up the steps, set her palm flat against the frame where the pencil lines lived, and breathed as if the boards were lungs she could fill. And when the light came on without switch or cord, she nodded once, as though it had kept its word and could rest now. And she sat in the rocker and said nothing for nearly an hour, while the rest of us fidgeted and made coffee and tried to act ordinary. And when she finally spoke, she said his name, Jonas, and the light dipped low and rose, and she closed her eyes, and her face softened in a way that made me look away, as though I was intruding on something I couldn't help but overhear. The weeks after felt different, like after you've heard a secret that changes how you carry yourself. The house no longer so strict, more companion than guard, but one night in early December, the hum woke me at 3, not frantic, but insistent. And when I stepped onto the porch, the frost bit my feet even through socks, and the bulb was bright in a way it hadn't been since the storm. And the swing moved with the tempo of someone pacing. And in the field I saw small moving lights. At first I thought were foxfire, but then realized were lanterns, 3 of them, bobbing along the tree line where no path lay. And I whispered out loud, though no one was near, "Who?" And the hum shifted. The bulb blinked once, twice, 3 times. And I understood in the slow way of understanding that some memories walk whether or not you feed them. That a house is not the only thing that keeps a promise. And I stood there until the lights faded. And when I went back inside, the ledger was open to a page I had not left it on. A line written darker than the rest, his boots at the edge of field. And I touched the page as if to warm it and said, I see him too. Snow came and buried the jars on the rail, and the swing froze stiff, the hum low and steady. And nights I would wake to silence, not heavy but complete, as if the house itself were sleeping. And I came to love those silences, the way they let me belong not as keeper or guest, but as part of its dreaming. One night near Christmas, I woke to the smell of kerosene strong enough to sting my nose, though no lamp burned, and I followed it to the porch and saw the light was off so completely I could see stars where its glow had once stolen the sky, and the hum was gone, and in its place the faint sound of steps descending, not up the stairs, down, fading into the ground itself. And I felt an ache in my chest like loss, but also like relief, as if something had finally chosen to rest. And I whispered thank you, and the word made a small cloud in the cold. And in that moment I understood that keeping the light meant also knowing when to let it go dark. When morning came, the bulb was still just a bulb again, cold glass, and I thought perhaps it was finished, that the story had closed. But later that evening, when I lit the lantern in the window out of habit, the porch light glowed softly to life, not demanding, not humming, just steady, like a companion walking beside you at dusk. And I laughed once, the sound sharp in the cold, and said, "All right, we'll keep each other then." And the swing moved just enough to brush the snow from the top step, and I stepped back inside, carrying both the silence and the hum in my chest like two parts of the same song. January came heavy and grey and seemed determined to test every board of the house, and I let it. I let the drifts shoulder themselves against the porch. I let the fields vanish under white that gleamed blue at dusk. I let the icicles fatten like teeth, and the porch light kept itself steady through it all, not loud, not fussy, just a calm gold in the storm, a warmth that told me when I looked out from the kitchen that the house was still awake, even if the world wasn't. The jar stayed buried, the swing stiff in ice, but I could hear the hum through the glass when the wind died, faint as a breath in another room. And some nights I would stand with my hand flat on the door frame where the pencil lines marched and feel that vibration in my bones. The ledger lived on the table still, and sometimes I'd find the pencil I kept there, nudged to the margin as if asking to write. And one night I gave in. I wrote the weather, the way the snow had crusted over into a glittering skin, the sound of the river cracking in the distance like slow applause. And the next morning, the porch light glowed brighter than usual at dawn, and the hum lifted high like approval. And I realized the keeping wasn't one-sided. It was a task shared. By midwinter, I no longer flinched when the light chose its moments. Sometimes it came on at odd hours when no storm threatened and no person passed, and I would go sit on the steps and breathe steam into the dark until I understood that not every flare was a warning. Sometimes it was just presence, a reminder that the line between gone and here is thinner than our eyes allow. Once near midnight, I heard faint laughter, children's laughter, drifting down from the porch roof itself, and I felt no fear, only a strange, hollow joy. And when I whispered, "I hear you," the bulb dipped twice like a nod. Another time, I woke to find the scarf from the attic draped over the rocker on the porch, though I hadn't touched it in weeks, and when I picked it up, the scent of cedar and old soap rose, and I wrapped it around my shoulders and sat there until the stars went out one by one. Then came February, and with it a thaw that pretended to be spring. For 3 days the world dripped, the yard turned to mud, the swing creaked free of its ice and moved on its own with no hum behind it, just air. And I thought maybe the light would fade with the season. But on the 4th night the temperature plummeted, the thaw froze hard, and the light came on before sunset, steady as a watchman, and I knew it wasn't done with me yet. That night I dreamed of Jonas. Though I had never seen his face, I knew it was him, standing on the ladder, one hand on the bulb, the other waving as though to someone behind me, and then falling, but falling without sound, like paper sliding from a table. And when I woke, the ledger lay open beside me, though I had left it on the table, and a single new line had appeared, not in my hand, still here. March arrived ragged, snow, then mud, then snow again, geese tracing low lines across the sky, and the neighbor stopped by with feed sacks in his truck and said, without preamble, that he'd heard the light had been steady all winter. And I said yes, and he nodded the way men do when the thing they feared is the thing they respect. And he said his grandson still talked about that night in the ditch, about the glow he'd seen across the field. And I realized the keeping was not just mine anymore. It had entered other mouths, other memory. That evening, Marion called, her voice full of wind, and said she'd been thinking about her grandmother again, about lanterns, about how promises linger in places. And she asked if in spring she could bring the bulb her family had saved in its box. And I said yes, we'll find it a place. And so I came to understand that the porch light was no longer simply a haunting or a relic. It was a covenant, one I had inherited without asking but chosen to continue. A thread stretched between the living and the gone. A small, fierce act of keeping watch in a world that forgets too quickly. Some nights it hummed low like a lullaby. Some nights it flared bright as judgment. Some nights it slept and left the lantern in the window to shoulder the task. But always it meant the same thing. Someone is home, someone is looking, someone remembers. And I found myself whispering back each night before bed, a phrase I had never planned to say but could no longer end the day without. I'll keep the light. Spring came on with mud that clung to my boots like a child that didn't want to be set down, and the porch boards swelled with damp and sighed beneath me. The swing freed itself and began to sway on evenings when no wind moved, and the light took to sparking on the twilight as if it wanted to catch the first geese cutting their lines across the sky. And sometimes when I stood at the rail, I could hear a low sound, almost like humming, but not from the bulb, from the boards themselves, a resonance that matched my own chest if I let myself breathe slow. One warm night, I sat with the ledger on my lap, pages soft with age, and as I traced the entries, I felt the pencil shift where it lay in the crease, rolling like it wanted to be used. And I wrote not dates or chores, but a question. Who are you now? And the porch light answered in 3 long pulses and 1 short one. Nothing I could translate, but enough to fill my chest with that odd ache that comes from being noticed. And when I closed the book, the hum subsided, as if satisfied. By May, the fields had greened. The deer slipped closer to the house in evening, and the neighbor's boy came riding his bike down the road and stopped to ask if he could sit on the swing. And I said yes, but mind the chain. And he sat there with his shoes barely touching the boards, and the porch light came on, not harsh, but gentle, and his eyes widened, and he looked at me and asked, "Is it magic?" And I said, "It's keeping watch." And he nodded, like he understood more than grown men did. And he rode home later, calling thanks over his shoulder. And when he was gone, I heard the faintest echo of laughter in the rafters, children's laughter layered with the creak of the swing, and I whispered, "I heard you too." In June, Marion came back, this time with her boys and her mother, and they brought the bulb in its box, wrapped in paper, browned with decades. And when we set it on the porch rail, the light above us hummed high as if in recognition, and the old woman set her hand on the box and closed her eyes, and for a long moment no one spoke, the boys restless until the swing moved on its own, and they quieted as if soothed. And then she said softly, "This was hers. She kept it near the bed. She said it held the last of him." And I knew she meant Elspeth, and I felt the air thicken with that kind of grief that never spoils. It just stays, like honey sealed in glass. We left the bulb in its box on the rail all night, and the porch light above us dimmed a little, not gone but restful. And in the morning the box was warm to the touch, though the air was cool, and I knew some exchange had happened I couldn't name. Summer spread out heavy and generous, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the road, and the porch became my refuge, the swing rocking me through nights loud with cicadas, the jars catching moonlight like old lamps, and sometimes the light would flare without warning, and I would rise thinking storm or danger. But it was only a deer nosing close, or the fox kits tumbling across the yard, or nothing at all but the weight of memory wanting company. And I came to understand that not every signal is a warning. Some are invitations, reminders to notice, to join, to stand still with what once stood here. One evening in late July, I sat with the ledger, and without planning I began to write my own days into its margins. Stacked wood, rain at dawn, neighbor brought cucumbers, Marion's boys laughed on the swing, and when I closed it the hum rose low and content, and I realized I had been adopted, folded into its keeping. When August storms rolled through, the light flared to a pitch that rattled the jars and shook the boards, but I stood on the porch and said easy, the way you say to a nervous horse, and it steadied, and in that moment I felt not fear but partnership, as though I had been tested and not found wanting. Nights after, I would sometimes see faint shapes at the edge of the field, lantern glows bobbing like fireflies too big and too deliberate, and I would whisper, I see you, and the porch light would dip in reply, and the hum would settle into me until I carried it into sleep. By the time the first leaves began to turn, I understood the truth. I had not just moved into a house with a haunted light, I had stepped into a vow, one made long before I came, one that would outlast me if I tended it well, and I accepted it the way you accept blood, not asked for, not always easy, but binding. And each night before I closed the door, I laid my hand on the frame where the marks of children grew into air, and I said the only words that mattered, I'll keep the light. And behind those words was the hum, steady, patient, alive, the sound of a house that remembered and meant to go on remembering. Autumn deepened like a bruise, the air colder in the mornings, the fields thinned to stubble that scratched the wind, and the porch light grew choosier, staying dark for days and then flaring with sudden certainty, as if it knew what it wanted to witness and refused to waste itself on anything less. The ledger pages had begun to smell faintly of smoke, though no fire touched them, and sometimes when I turned a leaf it lifted like a breath had moved beneath, and I wrote in it without hesitation now. Apples gathered, frost on the fence posts. Marion's mother sat on the rocker and cried softly into her scarf, and each time I closed it, the hum seemed to settle deeper into the floorboards, as though the house were filing my words alongside its own. The swing had grown bold, rocking at odd hours when no one sat on it, and one night, when I stepped outside in my coat, I found it moving steadily, as though carrying a weight I could not see, the chains groaning with effort, and I stood there long enough to feel that familiar ache in my chest. Grief and love twined so tightly, they felt like the same thread, and I whispered, rock them gently, and the swing slowed by degrees until it was still, November storms came in bands, sharp rain followed by quick freezes that turned the porch steps slick, and the light burned golden through it all, casting long spears across the yard. And more than once I thought I saw shapes walking in that glow, figures pausing at the rail as though checking in before moving on. And though I could not name them, I greeted each with a soft good night. The neighbor came by one afternoon with his grandson, and the boy asked with solemnity if the light would still keep them safe when the snow came. And before I could answer, the bulb pulsed once, twice, and his eyes widened, and he laughed with relief. And I said, yes, it will. And the old man gave me a look sharp with memory, but gentle with thanks. That evening I wrote the exchange into the ledger, and the pencil felt warm in my hand as though it had been waiting to record those words. Snow arrived in earnest before December was a week old, falling heavy, muffling the world, and the porch light shone through it like a beacon, its halo blurred in white, and I felt the weight of what it meant to so many who would never stand here again, but still needed to know it was kept. One night near Christmas, I set the lantern in the window, and the bulb above the porch dipped low, almost in a bow. And for a long hour the two flames kept company, one man-made and flickering, one impossible and steady. And the hum beneath the boards rose into something that felt like a song without words, a hymn only houses and ghosts know. I fell asleep in the rocker with the scarf around my shoulders, and when I woke, the snow had stopped. The yard was silver under the moon, and the light was still burning as if it had stood guard through every hour of my sleep. By the turn of the year, I understood I was not living in a haunted house, but in a covenant, a contract written not on paper but in persistence, in the simple fact of a bulb that would not quit. And I was part of it now, as bound as the names carved in the frame, as bound as the marks in the ledger. I no longer asked what it wanted. I knew. It wanted keeping. It wanted presence. It wanted someone to witness, to write, to remember. And so each night before I closed my eyes, I walked to the porch, laid my hand against the cool wood where the children's heights climbed into silence, and whispered the same promise I had spoken since the beginning. I'll keep the light. And the house answered with its hum, steady and sure, carrying me into sleep like a vow. January pressed down like a hand, the kind of cold that makes the boards pop at night and the windows weep with frost, and still the porch light burned, softer some nights, brighter others, as though it breathed with the weather itself. I rose before dawn many mornings to split wood, and each time I shouldered the door open, the bulb glowed steady, watching, keeping, and I began to feel less like it haunted me and more like it accompanied me. The ledger never left the table now. I wrote each day's small truths into its margins, split 12 logs, snow drifted past the second step. Neighbor's boy left a marble on the rail and the light blinked twice as if to claim it. And when I closed the book, I'd hear the hum beneath me deepen, an intake of breath satisfied that its story had not been lost. Some nights the swing moved without sound, back and forth so slowly it was like watching memory itself rock, and though my body ached from the work and the cold, I stood outside long enough to feel that the motion was not random. It was carrying someone or something, and when I whispered, "Rest easy," it slowed, then stilled, chains clinking like a sigh. By February, the storms were sharp and sudden, ice painting every wire and branch, and more than once the whole world outside went dark as the lines failed, but the porch light burned through, gold against black, and I could see from my window the faint suggestion of shapes moving in its glow, not frightening, but purposeful, as if travelers were checking the way before moving on. One night, the hum woke me at 3, and I found the lantern already lit in the window, though I had not touched it, and the bulb above glowed low, gentle, like a bow, and I knew some keeping had been shared without me, that the house itself had carried the duty while I slept. I thanked it anyway, out loud, because gratitude, I had learned, was its own form of fuel. March came ragged, thawing and freezing, mud clawing at my boots and geese crying overhead. And one evening, Marion returned with her boys. They ran to the swing as though it had been waiting for them, and the light flared to life, not sharp, but warm. And Marion's face softened when she saw it. She touched the frame with the pencil marks and whispered something I couldn't hear, but the hum deepened all the same, as though it had. That night her eldest asked if the light would always be here, even after we were gone, and before I could answer, the bulb pulsed once, twice, and I said yes, yes it will, because promises like that aren't made in words, but in the keeping itself. Spring finally pushed through, stubborn and loud, water rushing through ditches, the first green blades cutting the brown, and the porch light grew choosier again, sparking only at twilight, steady in storms, resting on calm nights. But I had stopped fearing its silences. I understood them now as sleep, as trust. And each night before bed, I laid my hand on the frame, over the pencil lines climbing into air, and said the same words I always did. I'll keep the light. And each night the hum answered, not loud, not showy, but steady, a heartbeat in the boards beneath my feet, reminding me that promises can outlive the people who make them, as long as someone is willing to hold them. April came with mud and birdsong, and the porch board swelled with the thaw, smelling of damp earth every time I stepped out. The swing rocked on its own in the mornings, a faint creak like an old song the house hummed to itself, and the light began to glow, not just at dusk, but in small, deliberate intervals during the day, as though it were less about holding off the dark and more about reminding me it was present even in the sun. I had stopped doubting those gestures. I wrote them down in the ledger. Light pulsed at noon while sparrows built in the eave. And when I closed the book, the pencil rolled as if agreeing. Marion came again, this time alone, carrying a folder of photographs. We sat on the porch steps and she spread them out between us. Children holding jars of lightning bugs, a man at the edge of the field with a ladder on his shoulder, a woman bent over a basin while lanterns hung in the background. The light above us burned low and steady the whole time, like it was looking too. And when she lifted one picture of her grandmother with the children lined against the door frame, the marks just beginning, she pressed her lips to it and said, "She never wanted to leave." And the bulb brightened so softly I almost missed it. But she didn't. Her eyes welled and she whispered, "I know." By May, the grass grew tall at the fence lines, and deer pressed close enough to leave hoof prints in the garden beds. One night, I found a jar I hadn't left, a cloudy blue mason jar, sitting on the rail with a single feather inside. I knew it hadn't come from me, nor from Marion, and when I touched the glass, it was warm, though the night was cool. I set it carefully on the step, and the porch light pulsed 3 times, slow, deliberate. The same rhythm it had given me that first night in the storm when I forgave it. I understood it as a gift, or a reminder, or perhaps both. The feather rests still on the mantle, untouched by dust. Summer unrolled heavy and sweet, fireflies stitching the fields with green sparks, crickets grinding their endless hymn, and the porch light rarely rested. Sometimes it burned all night, not with the strained hum of before, but with an easy steadiness, like a friend staying awake just to keep you company. More than once I saw faint shapes gather near the steps in that glow, shadows standing as though in conversation, and I found I wasn't afraid. I greeted them softly, and sometimes the ledger would be open in the morning with a new line in a hand that wasn't mine. Words small and plain. All is well, or children safe, or once still here. Those words I copied onto the wall beside the hide marks, not to claim them, but to keep them visible. The house seemed to approve. The hum beneath my feet deepened, like contentment. By the time the first leaves hinted at change, I knew I had become part of the house as surely as it had become part of me. The light no longer felt like a mystery or even a haunting. It was a covenant, old as grief, simple as breath, a promise to watch, to remember, to keep. And each night, no matter how tired, I stood at the frame with my hand pressed flat against the wood and whispered the words that bound me. I'll keep the light, and the bulb above glowed back, steady, golden, alive, as if to say, so will I. Autumn settled in full, leaves falling in slow spirals across the yard until the steps were buried ankle deep, and each time I swept them clear, the swing would rock once as though approving. The light had grown into its own rhythm, sparking on before storms, burning steady when Marion's boys came running up the walk, resting when nights were calm. I had learned to take its silences as trust. One evening in October, close to the anniversary of my moving in, the bulb burned brighter than it had in months, a rich gold that seemed to soak into the boards themselves, and the hum swelled low and deep until it filled my chest. I sat on the porch until the stars blurred, and in that glow I felt as if the house was not only keeping watch, but celebrating. When I finally went inside, the ledger was open on the table, a new line inked, dark and neat. 1 year kept. I traced it with my fingertip, grateful in a way too sharp to speak. The season turned sharp after that, wind cutting the fields down to bone, and the nights grew restless. More than once I woke to the sound of boots on the steps, though no one stood there when I looked. The light would flare when those noises came, not in warning, but in greeting, as if old company had arrived. One night I opened the door and whispered, "Welcome home," and the swing began to move as though carrying the weight of someone who had taken me at my word. I left them to it. In the morning, the scarf from the attic was draped across the rail, tied in a knot I hadn't learned yet, and when I touched it, the fabric held the faintest warmth. By November, storms swept through hard and fast. The power went out for 2 days, but the porch light burned like a star, refusing to falter. Travelers slowed on the road to look, their headlights sweeping across the field, and one neighbor said later he'd used my house as his compass home when the lines failed. I didn't correct him. I only nodded and thought, that's what it's always been. On the second night of the outage, I sat in the rocker wrapped in the scarf, lantern glowing in the window, and the bulb above me hummed a steady counterpoint. I realized then I wasn't alone in keeping the light anymore. The house was keeping me too. Winter crept back with its familiar weight. The yard vanished under drifts. The steps glazed with ice, but each morning the swing would move just enough to brush snow from the top step. The smallest kindness performed faithfully. And each night before I went to bed, I pressed my hand against the doorframe where the children's heights reached into silence and whispered the promise that had become part of me. I'll keep the light. And the hum beneath the boards answered, as it always had. Low, steady, patient, as if to say, together, we already are. January's cold pressed down with a patience that felt endless, a weight that settled into the marrow of the house as much as into me. But the porch light endured it with a kind of calm vigilance, never wavering, even as the wind cut at the eaves like a saw and the trees split with frost. I had long stopped wondering at its strength, stopped measuring its defiance against the grid or the weather, and instead treated it as a living companion, a presence that did not demand but remained. Each evening I would write in the ledger by habit, the book now nearly full with both the old lines and my new ones, and when I closed it, I could almost feel it pulse as if the words themselves carried heat. More often than not, I fell asleep in the rocker by the window with the scarf around my shoulders, the hum of the light carrying into my bones like a steady lullaby. Midway through the month, on a night so still, the air itself seemed brittle. The light flared brighter than I had ever seen, burning gold so rich it painted the snow in deep amber shadows. The swing moved with urgency, chains creaking sharp in the frozen silence. I rose and stepped onto the porch, breath clouding, boots sliding against the ice, and felt the boards tremble faintly beneath my feet. Out in the yard, shapes stirred at the edge of the glow, vague and tall, figures that did not belong to shadow or snow. And I felt no fear, only the same ache I'd known before. Love and grief twined together, a yearning that pressed against my ribs. The bulb pulsed 3 long beats, then 3 short, then 3 long again, and though I had only just learned to read Morse, I knew it instantly. SOS. My chest clenched with it, and I whispered, I'm here. I'll keep it. And the figures drifted closer to the light, pausing at the step as though to warm themselves. The hum grew low and deep, a vibration that rattled the jars on the rail. And then, as suddenly as it began, the flare eased, the glow softening, the figures slipping back into the snow's embrace. I stood there long after they were gone, until the swing stilled and the hum quieted to its steady undercurrent. And when I returned inside, the ledger lay open with a fresh line, written in a hand not mine. We are seen. The rest of the winter passed in quieter moments, but each night I felt more deeply the exchange between me and the house. Sometimes the light would flare when I was away at the neighbors, guiding me home across the dark field. Other times, it stayed low until I stood at the doorframe and placed my hand against the pencil marks, and then it would brighten like a greeting. I stopped doubting it. I stopped questioning whether I should. It had become part of the rhythm of living here, as natural as a wood smoke in the chimney or the frost on the window. By March, the snow began to rot at the edges, collapsing into patches of dark mud, and geese cried their ragged music overhead. I swept the porch clear of slush, boots soaked through, and as I worked, the light burned steady, watching, keeping. That night Marion came once more, this time with her boys and her mother again, and they brought a small box of bulbs, old and dusty, saved from a time when they thought maybe replacing the cursed one would break the spell. We set them on the rail, and the porch light brightened until every edge of glass gleamed, and I knew it was accepting, not angry. The boys played on the swing, their laughter high and sharp, and the chains groaned in time as if echoing the sound of children long gone. Marion's mother touched the frame again and whispered something too quiet for me to catch, and the bulb dipped low as though nodding. When they left, the jars on the rail rattled once, soft as applause, and the scarf in the rocker shifted as though some unseen hand had smoothed it for me. And so the cycle carried on. Storms would come and the light would blaze, nights of stillness would pass and it would rest, but always it was there, a keeper of memory, a companion in the dark. I no longer saw it as haunting. It was covenant, binding me as much as those who came before, and each night, without fail, before I shut the door, I pressed my palm against the marks where the children had grown into silence and spoke the vow aloud. I'll keep the light, and the hum, steady, patient, alive in the boards beneath me, answered as it always did, low and sure. Together